This is the philosophical angle, defining concepts in current media. I am your host, Chris Angle. I am the author of 4 books on philosophy, one of which is The Philosophical Equations of Economics. These books are available free for viewing at www.philosophypublishing.com. Along with me are our panelists, Mark Brennan, professor at the Stern School of Business, New York University. He is also the American editor of the Quarterly Review of London, England, established 1809. Also with us is Rick Samuelson. Rick graduated from Yale, has an MBA from Wharton, and an MA from Tufts. He is also retired head of security at UBS Japan. Good afternoon, guys.
Good afternoon.
The purpose of the philosophical angle is to examine the nature of the concepts being used in current media and compare the essence of the concept with the usage and circumstances in which the term is being used. The format of the philosophical angle is that your host will bring forth an opening statement on the nature of the concept for your consideration, and our panel will react with their criticisms and questions and their own definitions. And this week, the subject of the concept for discussion is the significance of deficits. The media has been talking about the failure of the super committee. This Uber committee's purpose was to come up with a plan to reduce government spending. As everybody knows and agrees that the federal government has been spending way beyond its means. Its rate of deficit spending is accelerating. The deficit next year in 2012, when compared to 2007, will have doubled. The government is in the midst of an orgy of spending. In 2009, there was the giant spending bill, which Congress passed speedily and hastily without anybody having read the entire bill. Most of the individual members, particularly the Democrats, as it was their bill, tacked on hundreds of spending amendments. Even today, not many, if any at all, know the content of the spending monstrosity. Congress then passed Obamacare, the cost of which are now starting to kick in. The spending is rampant, while the private sector has had problems growing and adding jobs. The federal government has hired over 200,000 jobs since the last presidential election. We can remember the major constituents of mass media in the not-too-distant past exclaiming that deficits do not matter. And as such, the government has jumped on the bandwagon, and it is building the deficits even higher, and oh, so quickly. So we, at the philosophical angle, would like to inquire if running up deficits is good for America. And we don't think so. Let's explore. When a government, or any entity for that matter, wants to spend money, it must, of course, get it from somewhere. The government gets it from the taxpayers, and the taxpayers get it from working. As you know, people work and get paid. From their compensation, they either spend it or save it. Saving it usually means they invest it. Maybe by putting it in a bank to collect interest, or by putting it in a stock purchase retirement plan, or invest in real estate, or whatever. There are many investment choices. However, sometimes people, businesses, and the government will want to spend more now than their income would allow. Thus, the entity will have to borrow, taking him into deficit spending. Of course, what the entity deficit spends now will have to be paid back later with interest. Naturally, this puts a burden on the budget, immediately following the borrowing and the spending. As everybody knows, after buying a car on a car loan, you must pay that monthly interest payment and the monthly principal. But what is important is that the payment now decreases the monthly discretionary income. If the borrowing and deficit spending continue and increase over time, the payback increases and the discretionary payments decrease. And if this scenario continues, eventually the entity's income does not support the payments to the creditors and there is a default. Presently in the news, the most famous example of this is the country of Greece, which has a bloated government. That is, there are so many people on the government's payroll that it has to borrow to keep paying everybody on the payroll, to the extent that the income from the working people through taxation no longer can support the payments for the government payroll, along with payments to the creditors from whom the government has borrowed. I have explained the obvious, and so now you say, so what? I know this. Well, here is the interesting question in this scenario. Was the borrowing by the government from the beginning up until the default, during the time that it was making the payments to its borrowers within the agreed terms, hurting the nation of Greece, or did it not matter because all terms and monetary obligations were being met? Or for that matter, does any government spending by any entity, any government, hurt the nation, or for that matter, that entity? The philosophical angle's answer is yes, it matters, and its influence is always negative. If government X goes into deficit spending, then it must increase its deficit or decrease another area where it was spending. Until now, Greece, the US, and many others have only increased its budget through deficit spending. This means that assuming that the deficit outpaces the growth of the nation's industries, that sometimes in the future the country will have to adjust downward its budgetary spending. But it also means that had it now has borrowed and overspent on present budgetary items, that is, it could present more services per dollar of revenue. It could even return a surplus revenue to the taxpayer if it did not deficit spend, which means a decrease in the American standard of living. When the private sector is able to keep its money and its government is lean, this will maximize the efficiency of both the public and private sectors, making for a prosperous and healthy economic society. We base this statement on the assumption that the private sector is more efficient than the government sector. Of course, there are necessary services that the government provides for which the populace willingly pays, such as for a judicial system, some infrastructure, national defense, civil order, protection of property rights. But when government steps outside of its required role, inefficiency nudges its nose in the door and society suffers. Therefore, when government deficit spends on items other than its primary role, as noted in the U.S. Constitution, inefficiencies develop and society suffers. At this point, government decreases its potential advancement of the standard of living of its societal constituents. Let's go to our panel. Guys, how now these government deficits? I'd like to start with you, Mark, first. What's your reaction?
I have to take exception with something you said about deficit spending always being a problem, or always something we should avoid. The country is running a deficit, and at the same time attacked by an enemy who has an express goal of killing everyone in that country. It pretty much doesn't matter what your deficit is. You should spend whatever it takes to repel that enemy. So deficits are not always bad, and I think your example pointed up the danger of using your reversals like always, never.
Okay, well, point well taken. Rick, what's your general reaction?
Well, I think the Keynesian argument for deficits really rests on one thin reed for justifying them, and that is this notion of the multiplier effect that we've talked about before. It being that if the government spends money now, that effect will multiply throughout the economy and somehow boost the private sector as well. So that's kind of a core Keynesian argument, and that the government, in the event of a situation where tax revenues have fallen, and that's certainly been the case in the recent recession, and it's pretty much the case in any recession, owes the constituents some sort of role in smoothing out the economic conditions by offering up unemployment insurance and so forth. I don't believe in a multiplier effect. I think the multiplier effect is zero. I think the research done on this subject has been inconclusive. The economy's too big to take account of all the cross effects that occur, and so it's not very convincing. It's almost a religious belief on the part of Keynesians and Democrats, but it's not one that's really based on much science. And the more obvious situation is that if you take tax away from one constituent to give to the government or give to another constituent, then that constituent member of society is by definition worse off and has less money to spend. So at a common sense level, it's hard to see how any significant deficit can do other than cause potentially very severe problems of the sort we see in Greece and Spain and Italy and so many other countries today, if it's allowed to run out of hand.
Absolutely agree. Mark, any observations?
Yeah, I would, the current communist in chief isn't a bad Keynesian, but we should also remember the clown before him who was mailing out $300 checks in probably what was the most textbook example of Keynesianism. Let's give certain Americans a $300 check, and then after they spend it, which they actually don't, if you know anything about microeconomics, giving somebody a one-time payment, they generally tend to save it. And then when he does his tax return in 9 months, we'll give him, a W-2 telling him that was actually income that he now has to report. So Bush took Keynesianism, injected it with LSD, and just made a mockery of it. But he was just as much of a Keynesian as our current communist in chief. So until we, break the idea that this stuff actually works, we can expect it from both the party of greed and the party of envy.
Okay. What about Rick's statement that Keynesianism and the stimulus spending multiplier effect doesn't work, and categorically doesn't work? Would you agree with that? What?
Yeah, I mean, on these one-time checks, that's the point I was getting at. You give somebody a one-time lump sum payment, they generally save it. If you increase somebody's paycheck over time by, say, cutting tax rates, which really stealing less of the guy's money than you had been before, or lowering the withholding tax or something like that, you can see their net paycheck goes up. They will tend to spend that. They give somebody a one-time lump sum payment. The literature on that basically indicates that people save that money, so there is no multiplier effect.
But
then you can go into other idiotic things. We'll say, okay, well, we won't give it to consumers. Let's have a program where we'll fly Americans to the moon, and maybe that will be something that will increase multiplier effect. Aside from the just sheer stupidity of saying the government has any right or has been empowered by the people to send Americans to the moon, to think that might have some kind of multiplier effect by, employing a bunch of people with pocket protectors in Cape Canaveral is just, taking this thing again to another level of stupidity that only government is capable of obtaining.
Okay, I'd like to make one observation here regarding that the check for $300, whether it's micro or macro, whether it's spent or invested. It doesn't. I feel it doesn't really come into this multiplier effect sphere of conversation here, because an investment is the same, is equivalent to spending. When you give money to somebody else for investment purposes, you're looking to get a return and make your money more efficient. So, but let us proceed and.
Well, again,
go ahead.
That investing money does not factor into the velocity of money. So I think Rick's point is clearer on this.
Okay, and then but why doesn't Keynesian? We know, we've established that it doesn't work. So, but why doesn't it work? And why doesn't a deficit spending or stimulus Keynesian type of use of money, why doesn't it work? Why doesn't the multiplier effect? Why isn't it effective? Rick, go ahead. Any observations?
Well, I think this kind of issue always has to be reduced to common sense, because it really does, the government really does, and the nation's economy really does operate as a kind of the same way a small community or family does. If I go to my next door neighbor and I give him $200, or even lend him $200 to go buy something, I have $200 less to spend. That's just a fact. And however you dress up that fact, that's basically what's going on when the government raises taxes or spends with in excess of its current revenues. And so, for every positive effect you could argue that comes of the government spending some extra money, there's an offset. It's almost like physics, equal and offsetting effect from taking that money away from some constituent at large. So the net effect, in my mind, by definition, has to be zero. It has to be. I would add that, the current failure in this deficit commission, I mean, to me, it's just, it's a tempest in a teapot, silly politics, and, basically posturing for next year's presidential election. It's not a substantive issue. Because in fact, if you were to rebalance the tax code and simplify the tax code, you could easily raise overall tax revenues, okay? That's known, and that's what Paul Ryan's been suggesting. That's what the Erskine-Bowles Commission suggested. I mean, this is not, the answer here is not very obscure. But instead, it's been painted by the media as a simple issue of the Democrats not wanting to tuck into cutting the benefits or entitlements, especially the large entitlements like Medicare and Social Security, or modifying them in any way, and the Republicans not wanting to raise taxes. Well, I mean, it's just a false issue, because you can address the tax code reform issue directly and deal with this problem by raising overall tax revenues while cutting rates, by the way, and at the same time attacking the obvious sources of the large deficit sources, which are the entitlements.
Okay, Mark, I think I heard you wanted to interject something. Go ahead.
I wanted to harp on Rick's first point and point our listeners to French philosopher Frederick Bastiat's 1850 essay, That Which is Seen and That Which is Unseen, in which he talks about the broken window fallacy and talks about how, if you go and smash a window, it then has to be replaced. So money must be taken to pay the glazier who works to repair that window. there's been no net benefit to society because that money had to be taken from somewhere. So you employed a glazier, but you made somebody pay some money who didn't want to do it. And that's basically all government spending is the broken window fallacy. I'd also just, toss out, we keep saying whenever Democrats refuse to cut spending and the Republicans refuse to allow taxes to be raised. The Republicans will squeal like stuck pigs if you say, maybe we should take 3 pennies out of defense spending. The Republican stance on defense spending is, when you ask them how much, the answer is more. When you ask them what is the right amount of money we should be spending on defense, more. So there's never been an analysis done on what is the right amount to be spent, what would be the most efficient amount to be spent on defense. With the Republican Party, it's always more, and any cut would be bad. So this will go nowhere, and it's been going nowhere. In the meantime, all that happens is that the deficits add up, the national debt accumulates, and we're driving 80 miles an hour towards a cliff, with our brakes in not the best working order.
Okay, I'd like to put my 2 cents in here. If we go to our board here, briefly, stimulus. One of the reasons why stimulus cannot work is because the essence of all production that's made up of the variables of risk, time, effort, and knowledge. And so in order for you to increase production, whether it's by deficit spending or by or any company investing in its future, it either has to reduce its risk, reduce its time, increase its knowledge, or reduce its effort in being. And of course, if it's a if it's a service, if it's a product, it'll be decreasing the material.
What do you mean reduce its risk?
Reducing the risk, for example, you have anytime you make an investment, you have risk, as you well know, involved in your decision whether the return on your investment is worth it. So you always have a risk-reward ratio, no matter what. And including your environment. Let's say you can also have political risk, market risk, and there are various types of risk. So without making any of those ingredients more efficient, then your stimulus will be impossible. So the only way to get a stimulus is from your operation on those variables, and the government in its deficit spending in nowhere makes an operation on any of those variables. It just goes out and spends. Therefore, it is as Rick points out. It's a static situation. You give one to take away from the other. So it is only the private sector that operates on the production facets of the variables that make up production, and that is where you provide true stimulus.
I've never heard of risk as being one of the factors of production. Where did that come?
It's just.
Is that something you invented, or is this from some accepted school of economics?
No, this is my equation.
Oh, okay. I thought it sounded a little bit.
That's right. You wouldn't be able to read it anywhere. You can only find it here at the philosophical angle.
Okay.
Well,
just to be clear, that's your economic theory and not necessarily that of myself.
it is here, and yes, it is only the economic theory being purported here by the philosophical angle. Yes, you cannot read that in any textbook.
Yeah, I think it sounds pretty clever anyway.
Well, perhaps you can come up with an exception to the statement, and we'll certainly gladly hear it. But let's get back to one more question that I've got before we run out of time here. Is that the deficit spending seems to be doing the same thing that a tax would do, and on the economy. And would you say that is correct? That the deficit spending is almost equivalent to the same as what a tax would do? Mark, how about your thoughts?
Is it almost the same? This is what, yeah, that's kind of a non-question.
I'm sorry. Let's make it clear. That is the same.
Is deficit spending the same as a tax?
The deficit spending.
Um, no, deficit spending is not the same as tax because there are, a lot of people say there are three ways we can solve the problem of deficit spending over time. We can issue tax to cover it, we can place a currency to pay it off, or we can issue debt. Issuing debt is the same thing as just taxing at a later date. So there's only two solutions. We can inflate or we can tax. So if deficit spending is going to be paid off through a tax, then it's the same thing as a tax. But if it's going to be paid off through inflation, then inflation is going to hit different people in different ways and be completely unrelated to, or non-correlated with how the tax would affect the economy and members of society. So the deficit spending is not the same thing as a tax.
Okay. Rick, any final thoughts?
Well, I would just say that as this applies to the current controversy in Washington and the quote-unquote deficit-cutting commission, it looks to me as if, politics will continue to prevail with both sides entrenched, that is to say the Democrats and the Republicans, and the president posturing because he has relatively poor election prospects for next year, and trying to position himself vis-a-vis, most likely Mitt Romney in the lead up to the election.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'd like to thank my guests, Rick Samuelson and Mark Brennan, for joining us. And this has been our weekly version of the Philosophical Angle. Thanks for joining us, and see you next week.
Thank you.
Thanks.